Not so long ago, our society was rich in stories. Stories that gave us meaning and identity and purpose. We called these stories myths. And along the way, we've lost those old stories without replacing them with new ones.
When we want to make sense of something, the sense we seek is not scientific sense, but narrative fidelity. Facts and figures have no power to displace a persuasive story. The only thing that can replace a story is a story.
And I actually feel we're at a very, very positive time. I think it's a time of opportunity. It reminds me of the 60s, the late 60s, when there was a great outpouring of unity and gatherings and optimism. And this is the first time, I suppose, in this late part of my adult life that I feel I'm touching that again.
Sitting comfortably? Seatbelts on? We're off on another adventure in Nutopia. With me, David Brownlow. Chocolate hobnob, anyone? The three voices you heard at the beginning were Alex Evans, George Monbiot and Daphne Astor, summing up the theme of this episode and entire podcast series, our need for new myths to live by, stories that unite rather than divide us, stories that respect the natural world rather than trashing it. Alex is the author of a book, The Myth Gap. George Monbiot is an activist, filmmaker and journalist. Daphne is an agroecologist and an old hippie, reminding us of the need for optimism and empathy in all that we do. We'll meet all three of them in this and future episodes. The format of this opening episode is a little bit different to what's to follow. In future episodes, along with interviews, there'll be journeys, experiments, games, rituals, festivals and live performances. But first we need to lay the foundations for all that is to follow, by exploring how, in the West, we became so entrenched in narratives and metaphors of selfishness, combat, greed, of winner takes all, and of treating nature as an unintelligent machine, a mere resource to be plundered. After first unravelling the past, in the second half of this episode, we'll explore radical ideas for a more inclusive, networked and ecological future, thanks to philosopher Alan Watts and guests Jeremy Lent, Sharon Blackie, George Monbiot and Brooke Palmieri. Bear with us for this episode, there's a lot to pack in. In 2016, I was performing at Green Man Festival in Wales. Along with the live music was also comedy, talks and demonstrations. One area, Einstein's Garden, was dedicated to science. Wandering about there, I was drawn to a tent called the Egg and Sperm Race, run by a clutch of young, enthusiastic scientists there to teach kids about reproduction and fertility. I wandered into the tent. Inside was the equivalent of a scalextric or train set with motorised vehicles on windy tracks. Each vehicle had a sperm painted on the side. Kids were encouraged to race each other to see who could get to the end first. The winner, the fastest, was then given what looked like a wiggly baseball bat and taken outside to a piñata hanging from the tree. If you haven't guessed by now, the wiggly bat represented the winning sperm and the piñata the egg. The lucky child then beat the living daylights out of the piñata/egg until it burst, a load of sweets fell out, and that's how babies are made. I could see what the team were trying to do, but I had my suspicions it was likely to leave kids more confused than ever, not least for the association of violence and sweets with the act of reproduction. Saying that, we've all been there. What is curious are the choice of metaphors for the egg and sperm race. The piñata and racing vehicles both point to narratives of our bodies as machines and nature as combative, competitive and ruthless, with winners and losers. Such metaphors are rife in our culture. We talk of the building blocks of life. We liken our thoughts to a train. We talk of being programmed to act in certain ways and describe our brains as soft machines. We are hardwired to think in such metaphors as hardwired. Even James Brown sung about being a sex machine. Some of our most successful and influential scientists, like Richard Dawkins, use such powerful metaphors to get their ideas across, likening nature to a ruthless and selfish machine, and humans little more than lumbering robots. But perhaps that's just how Dawkins comes across on the dance floor.
We organisms, you, me, an octopus, a forget-me-not or a giraffe, are survival machines. We're vehicles for the genes that ride inside us, vehicles that are thrown away after we've handed the precious coded information on to the next generation.
Even our most beloved naturalists and presenters rely on metaphors of war and combat to describe the nature of nature.
Plants are competing ferociously with one another to claim the light. Battle is at its fiercest on the forest floor. Target is in range, is armed with dozens of claw-like hooks, will be able to smother its victim. But it fights back using chemical warfare. It's a long-distance attack, strike and counter-strike. This balsa has won its battle for the light, leaving the losers in its shadow to fight among themselves.
As well as mechanical and combative metaphors for describing how life works, our language belies a belief in our superiority over nature and the very universe itself when we talk of conquering mountains or conquering space. This myth of superiority is particularly noticeable with regard to the animal kingdom, with almost every animal metaphor in our language being derogatory, not complimentary. If I was having an argument with my partner Anne about whose turn it was to do the washing up, we'd be spoilt for choice for insults, and could even include mythical beasts. We even denigrate the very soil itself when we talk of someone being little more than the dirt beneath our feet.
The washing up hasn't been done. I bet that louse of a partner is playing his glockenspiel again. Oi, Bramwell, you toad, come and do the washing up, monkey brain.
Stop badgering me, you old shrew.
Sloth.
Cow.
Pig.
Weasel.
Cockroach.
Dragon.
Ass.
Worm.
Snake.
Moose.
Dirty rat.
Old goose.
Stupid tapir.
I don't know that one.
Oh yeah, everyone knows that.
What, like, are all tapirs stupid, or is it just like the Malayan tapir? That's pretty stupid.
I think all tapirs are fundamentally stupid.
By contrast, there are few complementary animal metaphors. The charity People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, have even been campaigning for us to stop using these speciesist insults. As Anais Nin put it, we see the world not as it is, but how we are. And what are we but our stories, our myths? So how did we come to think of ourselves and nature in this way? As the title of this episode is New Myths to Live By, let's begin by reminding ourselves of what a myth actually is, not least because of the way the word has been increasingly misused over recent years. In fact, the best use of that hackneyed and misleading term myth-busting is to turn it on itself. A myth is not a lie, it's a metaphor. Here's writer Sharon Blackie.
I suppose I do like the definition of myth that suggests that it is something that helps us make sense of the world around us. A myth to me has an explanatory function. It's why the world is like this, and potentially, where do we fit into the greater picture of it? To me, they are the underpinning narratives of our culture. We live by cultural myths which have explanatory value. And I think people don't really see that. They think that the world is the way the world is, and they don't understand that there is a choice of narratives that the culture chooses to operate by.
We'll hear more from Sharon later, but to answer her question as to what narratives have most influenced Western culture, we need to turn to the self-styled entertainer-philosopher Alan Watts. Those unfamiliar with Watts could do worse than seek out a few animated shorts on YouTube created by the South Park team to accompany some of his key ideas. At his zenith in the 50s and 60s, English-born Watts lectured across the length and breadth of America to the counterculture, academia, and at times even corporations and multinationals. Watts had something interesting to say about almost everything, and an amazing ability to pick apart Western culture and also present the paradoxical ideas of Eastern thought in an accessible and fun way. He used good metaphors, likening our Western approach to compartmentalizing and categorizing nature as casting a net over a wiggly world. If asked where the combative, competitive and mechanical metaphors found in the egg and sperm race originated from, Watts would point to two great myths that came to dominate Western thought over the past 2 millennia, which he called the ceramic myth and the fully automated myth. Here's Alan Watts.
Western man has for many centuries been under the influence of two great myths. Number one, the image of the world as an artifact, like a carpenter's table or a jar made by a potter. Indeed, in the book of Genesis, there comes the idea that man was originally a clay figurine made out of the earth by the Lord God, who then breathed into this clay figurine and gave it life. And it is therefore natural for a Western child to say to its mother, "How was I made?" That would be quite an unnatural question for a Chinese child, because the Chinese do not think of nature as something made. They look upon it as something that grows, and the two processes are quite different.
And one final other point from Alan about this myth.
This ceramic model of the universe originated in cultures where the form of government was monarchical, and where, therefore, the maker of the universe was conceived also at the same time in the image of the king of the universe.
So we came to think about the universe and ourselves as something that was made, and the universe conceived through the political metaphor of a monarchy, with God as supreme ruler cum potter, who created the laws and breathed life into us and all of nature from the dirt and mud. A bit like Grayson Perry crossed with Henry VIII and Frankenstein, sort of. By the medieval times, also woven into this myth was the idea of the great chain of being, perceiving the universe as a hierarchy. Think of a pyramid with God at the top, his subjects, us, below, and then below us, the animal kingdom, plants, fungi, soil, and then right at the bottom, amateur accordion players. No, I'm only kidding. What's important to note here is that the great chain of being was in stark contrast to the mythologies of our indigenous and nomadic ancestors, who imbued all of nature with spirit and intelligence and saw themselves as an intrinsic part of this complex web. The ceramic myth put us apart from nature. Humans, it told us, possess souls. Animals and plants do not. If we obeyed God, nature was ours to be tamed, exploited, subdued, and conquered. But, spoiler alert, the idea of a supreme ruler creator God would of course come to be discredited as our common sense way of relating to the world.
This particular image or myth became too much for Western man because it was oppressive. And so instead we got another myth, the myth of the purely mechanical universe. This was invented at the end of the 18th century, became increasingly fashionable throughout the course of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, so that it is today's common sense. So instead it has become fashionable, and it is nothing more than a fashion, to believe that the universe is dumb, that intelligence, values, love, and fine feelings reside only within the bag of the human epidermis, and that outside that, the thing is simply a kind of a chaotic interaction of blind forces.
But we have been brought up not to feel that we belong in the world. So our popular speech reflects it. We say, I came into this world. You didn't. You came out of it. And we talk about the conquest of space, the conquest of Everest. And the great symbols of our culture are the rocket and the bulldozer.
So, as we know, science took precedence over religion as a means of understanding and relating to the universe. The mechanical myth presented a universe that no longer had a heart or an inherent intelligence, and so we used mechanical metaphors of blind forces to explain the seemingly miraculous existence of life. But was this new myth really that different from what had come before? And what were its consequences? Introducing author Jeremy Lent. More about who Jeremy is later.
We thought that the scientific revolution was this kind of break from the past. In fact, Descartes, who kind of was the one who first instilled this idea of nature as a machine, and the idea of I think, therefore I am, was actually kind of taking these ideas of Christianity and sort of reformulating them for the modern world. So much of what we just take for granted has got these deep roots that you have to dig really deep to even begin to see that they were just conceptions. And a second reason why it's so pervasive in our world today, this idea of nature as a machine, is because, quite honestly, it's been very successful as a way of actually making sense of things and as a way of actually creating sort of human dominance over nature. That the people who based these ideas on seeing nature as a machine, essentially called reductionism, like scientific reductionism, got to think that that was the only way to make sense of the universe. And that's the only way in which the entire universe can be understood. There's no other way of conceiving it. That was the mistake that I think Western thinking got stuck in. And that's led to a lot of these imbalances that we experience today. I mentioned Descartes earlier, but fundamentally, the way in which most people think about who we are as human beings and who we are relative to the rest of the natural world today comes from this profound statement, profoundly wrong, but a very deep statement of Descartes, where he said, "I think, therefore I am." Basically, what he was saying is the only part of me as a human being that has true existence is in fact the thinking capacity. Now, that thinking capacity does differentiate humans from many other or most other creatures, but his notion was that it's the only thing that we can truly believe in as our true existence. And in his mind, that's what links us to divinity. Just like Plato thought 2,000 years earlier, that's what links us, that's our soul, which he reconceived as our mind. Therefore, our bodies are not actually, they don't have any intelligence at all. They're just kind of these mechanical housing for our core essence, our thinking capacity. And of course, other animals who don't think like we are, they don't have a true existence. They're just machines. And Descartes himself said that explicitly. He said, I don't see any difference between machines that humans construct and the machines that nature constructs, that are other animals or whatever, which is why he felt like vivisection, nailing up a dog on a board and cutting her open to see how the heart worked or whatever, while the dog was squealing in pain. He said, oh, that's just like the same thing as if you're strumming the string on a violin string. It's just a sound, has no meaning. So that's led to this mechanistic view of nature that we have today, where we see nature as a resource. We see it as something to exploit for human benefit, which is really one of the fundamentals of capitalism. Our entire system is based on exploiting and extracting from what is non-human, seeing that as something that's just there for us to use. That's very different from what non-Western cultures conceived of as nature. They saw themselves as being part of nature. They saw all of life as being part of family, basically, in indigenous cultures around the world, which is actually one of those things that modern biology validates now, that we actually do have a shared common ancestor with every other living being around us.
As Jeremy points out, and must be acknowledged, the mechanical myth was incredibly successful in so many ways. Viewing the body as a system of machine-like parts, for example, has led to incredible advances in medicine, such as our ability to replace vital organs and joints or create vaccines. But it has created an imbalance of us primarily thinking of things in terms of their parts rather than holistically. Our mental health crisis, for example, is something that our mechanised approach to health is ill-equipped to handle. And don't get me started on hospital food. A more fundamental problem with the metaphors of the mechanical myth is summed up by mythologist Merlin Sheldrake in his book Entangled Life, in which he writes, "If we understand organisms to be machines, we'll be more likely to treat them as such." This, combined with the pervasive myth of our superiority over nature, remains our justification for the incredible suffering experienced by animals in laboratory experiments and in intensive farming. And it could even be argued that this myth influenced the way we treat ourselves, from the slave labour and the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution to sweatshops and Amazon warehouses today, where many staff report that they skip toilet breaks to ensure that they don't miss their quotas. Does the machine serve us, or do we serve it? A final thought here. Jeremy Lent points out that the metaphor of nature as a machine is increasingly being challenged across many branches of science, such as system science, ecology, and in ideas like the Gaia hypothesis. What Alan Watts was suggesting was that the mechanical myth remains embedded in our collective idea of what is common sense. Time to take a breath? Biscuit break? We've packed in quite a lot so far. As George Monbiot stated right at the beginning of this episode, the only thing that can replace a story is a story. With the many problems facing the world, and you don't need me to spell them out, what of new myths for a network age? Myths of cooperation, restoration, community, sustainability and fairness. Myths that demonstrate our interdependence with nature and honour it with the same respect and rights that we give to companies and to ourselves. And might some of the metaphors and myths that we need right now be in fact very old? Here's Sharon Blackie, acknowledging the great chain of being and sharing the idea of re-embracing the myth of the anima mundi.
Yeah, I mean, that hierarchy goes all the way back to Aristotle, of course, and was taken up with relish by Christianity. So in some parts of Europe, it was very strong. But before Aristotle, you had this wonderful perspective, which was very real at the time in the classical world of the anima mundi, the world soul, that was in everything. It was in everything, not just humans, but rocks, trees, that everything was imbued with soul, which is a very animistic perspective on the world. And given that, it was very, very difficult, to argue that cutting down a tree doesn't matter. And of course, most indigenous mythologies, cosmologies rather, have that sense of everything in the world being animate. And to me, part of the problem is, yes, it's a bad thing that we've taken God out of the equation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've taken the Christian or Judaic concepts of God out of the equation, because that was a very patriarchal perspective on the world. The divine, before Christianity came along, was seen to be something that is intrinsic in everything in the world. And that to me seems to be a much healthier way of looking at it. And so, you can see traces of that even in old British and Irish stories, myths, literature from way, way, way back. So in Wales, for example, there's a wonderful, in fact, the oldest Arthurian story about two characters called Culhwch and Olwen. They are looking for a stolen infant. They can't find him, so they go to the villagers, and the villagers don't know. And then they send them down the road to a village where there are older people, and they go to the older villagers, and the older villagers don't know. And eventually, in this trek, somebody says to them, oh, no, you need to go to the animals. So they go to the animals, and the animals say, no, you need to go to the oldest animals, and they will know. And sure enough, the oldest animals, who include a salmon and an eagle, know. So there is inherent in all of this the idea that animals have wisdom that we don't, and sometimes we need it. That there is a difference there, but it is a difference that matters. We were like that for most of our history. So all of this scientism, and all of this profoundly patriarchal religion is actually quite a new thing for us. And I think there is, I tend to look on the positive side and think that there is some kind of bone memory in us that has a knowledge of that and recognizes it. And you don't have to do anything very drastic to suggest to people that they might look at the world in that way. We can see, just as our ancestors did, that there is something here that we really, really need to regain if we want to transform the world into something that we don't see as there for our taking, but something in which we are participating.
Keeping on the theme of the wisdom of nature inherent in many aspects of modern paganism and in the beliefs of our pre-Christian ancestors, so some ancient Eastern philosophies also teach our interdependence with nature. Alan Watts came to passionately believe that the destructive forces of the Western mindset could be liberated through systems such as Taoism if brought to realise that the universe is neither dumb and mechanical nor the creation of an omnipotent monarch, but a self-organising intelligent organism of which each and every one of us is a unique expression, like a wave on an ocean. Worth noting here is that the Eastern idea of intelligence is not in a Stephen Frywin's mastermind kind of way, but in the myriad processes taking place simultaneously in organisms, such as breathing, growing hair, skin, exoskeletons and shells, eating and digesting food, moving, photosynthesizing. The fact that musician Sting can record an album of lute music and do yoga shows he is an intelligent organism. That cacti can survive in harsh desert environments and deter predators with spiky bits shows that they are too.
You do not find an intelligent organism living in an unintelligent environment. Look, here is a tree in the garden, and every summer it produces apples, and we call it an apple tree, because the tree apples. That's what it does. All right. Now here is a solar system inside a galaxy. The peculiarities of this solar system is that at least on the planet Earth, the thing peoples. In just the same way that an apple tree apples. Because you see, we grow out of this world in exactly the same way that the apples grow on the apple tree. If evolution means anything, it means that. But you see, we curiously twist it. We say, well, first of all, in the beginning, there was nothing but gas and rock. And then intelligence happened to arise in it, you know, like a sort of fungus or slime on the top of the whole thing. But we're thinking in a way, you see, that disconnects the intelligence from the rocks. Where there are rocks, watch out. Watch out, because the rocks are going eventually to come alive.
In light of Watt's poetic prophecy of the rocks coming alive, I couldn't resist sharing this short account of philosopher, poet and trans pioneer Michael Dillon, as told by artist Brooke Palmieri, who we'll meet properly later in this episode.
In his biography, there's this moment where he goes, he's a ship surgeon and he's traveling the world. They land in New York. He goes to the science museum and sees a meteorite. And he just says, this meteorite has given me such a sense of the fact that it's living and thinking. But given how many millions of years old it is, it's just moving at a level that I'm not capable of keeping up with. So I'll never understand what it's thinking or feeling, but it's alive. And I think that's such a good definition of animism, this idea that you encounter these mysterious objects in your life whose timescales and lifespans you cannot keep up with, either because they're too brief, like a fruit fly, or because they're too long, like a pebble. But knowing that there are timescales outside of our subjectivity is enough, I think, to imbue my life with more of a sense of sanctity. For me, the idea that everything we encounter is imbued with some kind of spirit is a huge challenge. It requires me to take responsibility for all of my actions. But yeah, it raises the bar of what it means to respect the earth that you walk on, to respect the people that you meet. It makes you have to think about the trail you leave in the world and the way you use things.
So Sharon Blackie and Alan Watts touched on indigenous, pre-Christian and Eastern mythologies that teach the wisdom of nature and allow us to relate to the natural world in a more integrated and symbiotic way. But what of new ideas, new narratives that challenge the competitive and mechanical metaphors of our prevailing myths? Jeremy Lent, who we've heard from once already, is the author of two monumental works, The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning, and is a key exponent of a new and growing movement known as Ecological Civilization.
What we need to change in our current society is not just our economics, not just our education, not just our technology, not just the corporations, whatever. We have to change the entire foundation of our civilization itself. We're built on a foundation of that extraction and exploitation. And what I love about the ecological civilization notion is it allows us to start thinking, what would it look like if we built a civilization, actually a life-affirming basis, saying, let's set the conditions for the flourishing of all human beings on a regenerated earth. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game that some get wealthier at the expense of others. If we look at what an ecological civilization might offer us, we can look at what it would be like to design our human society on the same principles that nature itself is used for ecosystems to flourish and to be rich and resilient for millions of years. Even with all the things happening from the outside, they stay stable and they stay flourishing. They grow and they adapt, but they retain their essential essence. And they do that according to certain principles. Mutually beneficial flourishing is one. Integration of all the different parts is another. And there's like maybe 6 or 7 key principles that life uses that we can use in a way that is kind of reworked for our human society.
One idea he explores in his book, The Web of Meaning, is regenerative farming, something we've dedicated a whole episode to later in the series. Another is that of a worldwide declaration of rights that would put the natural world on the same legal standing as humans. Yet another is for corporations above a certain size to be chartered with the explicit purpose of optimizing not just shareholder returns, but also social and environmental outcomes.
Well, one of the most exciting really has to do with this notion of the commons. Basically, the commons is more that like the deep historical way in which humans actually relate to each other and the environment. Basically, looking at our relationship with nature, not as having private property and owning stuff and then keeping others out from it, but actually sharing the communal resources for the common good. And when you think about the commons in that way, you actually think about not just for the common good right now, but for generations in the future. But the commons actually works in the modern world. When we look at something like Wikipedia, this incredible, powerful instrument of knowledge that we can all be so grateful for, that is an example of the commons working, where actually, rather than some company saying, I'm going to own all this information and I'll make myself a billionaire by being an entrepreneur, selling the stock in this thing. It was this incredible vision of let's let people self-organize based on their desire, not to try to beat somebody else in status, but actually share their knowledge with the rest of life. And that's what is so powerful, because humans want to be part of community. They want to share their skills. These are kind of core indigenous values, but these are the values on which an ecological civilization could be built. Something like Facebook, it causes so much harm and evil because it's only focused on profit maximization. But if the system was self-organized to be in the interest of the people who use it rather than making the money, it would come up with very different algorithms for determining how things should be shared. We have this global capitalist society. And so most wonderful ideas then get sucked into that vortex of exploitation and extraction and become Google and Facebook, et cetera. But in fact, the internet was a technology that actually lends itself more than anything to the commons. And in fact, when I look at Facebook right now, I don't think that the right way to deal with this kind of monster that has evolved is to break it up the way some people talk about, or regulate it more or whatever. I think the most powerful thing to do is take this incredible scaled up form of communication between billions of people on the earth and turn it into the commons. And what that would mean is like taking ownership away from the investors and the shareholders and actually giving the ownership to the people who use it. There's this technology called DAO, Distributed Autonomous Organizations, that actually has developed ways to enable this to happen, which by the way, that's often called DAO for short, which I love because it's almost like the Taoist approach to technology, right? Imagine if everyone got a shared ownership in Facebook based on how much they used it. So if people used it a lot, they got to have a bigger say in how it developed as a system. And if there were revenues that came in from advertising, then they actually got their share of the revenues based on how much they actually used it, rather than based on how much money they invested into the stock or whatever.
Another fan of the commons is journalist, activist and environmentalist George Monbiot.
Can I give you another example of a commons?
Go on.
You're sitting in it.
Yeah.
This is an allotment site. The land itself is owned by the city council, but the management and control of that land is entirely in the hands of the 220 plot holders, each of whom controls their own plot, but controls the organisation through the Allotments Association, and determines the management of the site as a whole. This is a classic commons. It's a resource controlled by a community. And this allotment site, well, it's been running for decades and it works really well.
George has given the idea of future narratives, new myths to live by, a lot of thought too. His TED Talk on the need for new political stories suggests one of kindness, altruism and cooperation, which he calls the politics of belonging. From his allotment in Oxford, he shares new narratives that he feels are essential for a sustainable future. Note to listener, we'll dedicate an episode to donut economics sometime in the future, once I've got my head around it.
So I would point to 4 pillars which together amount to that transformation and together amount to restoring harmony to the land. One of them is Jeremy Lent's Ecological Civilisation. I think it's absolutely crucial. I think he's one of the greatest thinkers of our time. Another of them is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, which looks at how we can all live within planetary boundaries without falling below the standards of welfare and security that every human being should have a right to. The third one is participatory democracy, building on the built experience in Porto Alegre, the city in southern Brazil, in Reykjavik, in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Taiwan, where there have been some fascinating experiments with participatory democracy, which in some cases have been extremely successful. It seems to work much better in practice than it does in theory. People can come up with all sorts of reasons of why it won't work, but then once people start engaging in participatory democracy, it seems to transform them. It has this remarkable effect where people become a lot more serious about politics and a lot more hopeful about politics because they're involved, because they have taken back control in a genuine way, not in the way that we were promised, but they've genuinely done that. The fourth pillar is what I call private sufficiency, public luxury. And so it's this idea that we all have our own small domain, which belongs to us, our own home and the necessary stuff in that home to have a decent life within our private domain. But if we want luxury, we just can't afford to pursue luxury within the private domain. There's just not enough physical or ecological space on Earth. I mean, if everyone tried to have their own swimming pool and their own tennis court, and then London would occupy half of England and England would occupy all of Europe. You know, there's just not enough space. But there is enough physical and ecological space for everyone to have public luxury, magnificent public swimming pools and public tennis courts and public parks and a public health system and public transport, and we can have really high quality public luxury without taking space away from anyone. In fact, we're providing space for everyone and with a far smaller ecological impact per person than private luxury have, because we're sharing that luxury rather than pursuing it exclusively.
Even though we've only touched on these lightly, Jeremy Lent and George Monbiot demonstrate the wealth of ideas and new narratives that are out there and are challenging our established myths of selfishness and exploitation. From the commons to ecological civilization, donut economics to a declaration of rights for the natural world. And through a resurgence of interest in paganism, druidry, animism, Eastern wisdom, and through our very old myths, can come a shift of understanding that nature is not just a resource to be plundered, but something we're an intrinsic part of. What we do to nature, we do to ourselves. In exploring the idea of new myths to live by, it would be churlish to ignore the fact that one of the most visible paradigm shifts in recent years has been around gender identity. Over the last 2 millennia, Western culture favoured a binary way of describing the natural world and itself, and this through the lens of patriarchy. And while the world's top 10 rich list remain the kind of men who wear bootcut jeans and dream of driving a Ferrari on Mars, a new generation are challenging our established myths of gender identity, gender roles and stereotypes. And yet again, some are finding connections in the stories that predate the ceramic and mechanical myths. Here's Sharon Blackie, followed by non-binary artist, pagan practitioner and founder of camp books, Brooke Palmieri.
So the pre-Christian cosmology of what we might think of as Celtic countries is intensely female-centered. So women. So although there were a lot of heroes kind of like running around and doing stuff, the strings were mostly pulled by otherworldly women who also were kind of representations, for want of a better word, of the land. Really, everywhere you go in our old traditions, women were important. They kind of had the moral authority of the other world. They were the ones who came out and said, you would be a good king, but there is a bargain that you've got to make with the land and with the other world, in order to be king. And if you break it, terrible stuff will happen. Women had a really important role. And part of my passion is to draw people's attention to that, so women understand that it wasn't always like this. Again, that's a blip in history. You see that throughout Europe. Feisty, wonderful old women, the Furies in the Greek tradition, Mother Hulda in the German tradition. The Fates were old women, literally weaving the world and the fates of people into being. So there's a lot of threads there that just really, again, don't really very much get talked about.
The earliest in my own life depictions of gender fluidity came from myths developed in so-called pagan cultures. And explorations into indigenous cultures and their belief systems as they were recorded by colonizers and missionaries are the first kind of descriptions of people who do not fit a gender binary. So it was outside of Christianity first, and then you see these moments where there's uptake. You have saints that are sainted for growing a beard when they don't want to get married to someone. You have these moments where Christian mythos, I think, also has gender bending moments. But it was much more, for me, something that I could find in indigenous history, and so that also informed my very deep need for a regular spiritual practice.
As Brooke noted, outside of our ceramic and mechanical myths, identifying as non-binary or as a third gender was and still is common across many indigenous cultures, from the Mushai of Mexico's Zapotec people, brother boys and sister girls from Australia's First Nation people, the boy love of the Wakashu of Japan, Indonesia's fifth gender of trans priests known as Bisu, and the queer culture of the Metis from Nepal. I could go on, but I've probably mispronounced enough. In the animal kingdom too, there is no single way of doing things. We need only think of the difference between the hermaphroditic qualities of worms and the female praying mantis's fondness for post-coital cannibalism. We're also finally starting to acknowledge that same-sex relationships exist in nature, from beetles to flamingos to penguins, as well as transgenderism, such as the ability of female pheasants to increase their testosterone levels, change plumage, stop laying eggs and develop secondary sex characteristics. Though they do stop short of performing a solo show about it at Edinburgh Fringe. So what of future narratives, new myths centred around gender? Brooke Palmieri shares some of their optimism around where they might originate.
There's been a profusion of access to information for people to go beyond the binary. And whenever that kind of happens, whenever there's that massive shift in consciousness, there's always backlash. I mean, in terms of historical pattern spotting, you think about the most revolutionary moments in human history, and there's always that incredibly violent backlash. And that's even true for the contemporary queer rights movement. Every time any type of ground was gained, there was always following it. In England, after the Wolfenden Report, police brutality against gay men increased rather than decreased, and so you always have these moments where there is a consciousness shift, and then there's an incredibly brutal reprisal against it. So I have to hope that the brutal reprisals I'm seeing around me are indicative of this wider diffusion of non-binary thinking, of trans inclusivity, of a more celebratory and like joyful uptake of gender fluidity. I think one example I have of that is I work part-time in one of the oldest queer bookshops anywhere, Gay's the Word, in London. And what I would say is what I see there from week to week are just hundreds, if not thousands, of people passing through that bookshop who are young, who are identified as non-binary, and who are looking for books that nourish that identity, and who are also talking amongst their friends about the books they're going to write that reflect that identity. And so I also know that in this numbers game, there are more young people who are embracing the natural fluidity of life than there are people funding hatred and intolerance of that fluidity.
Which leads us finally to a maxim, a new myth to live by, that this series would like to offer. In a positive revolution, there is no enemy. Even though I agree wholeheartedly with George Monbiot's appraisal of the problem at the heart of modern politics,
We are a society of altruists, but we are governed by psychopaths.
it's easy to make politicians, law enforcers, or those with contrary views to our own as figures of hate. When the Dalai Lama was asked, and I paraphrase, why are there so many arseholes in the world, he smiled and replied, to thicken the plot. Our enemies can also be our teachers. We'll finish with Jeremy Lent.
It is very easy when looking at what's going on in the world today. It's easy to get distraught. It's easy to feel a sense of hopelessness and incredible anger at the destruction taking place, and then to turn that anger into anger at those people who are the agents of the destruction. And I feel every one of those things. So I'm not considering myself to be above any of those feelings. But I think what is crucial is exactly this point, to realize that the very people who are the agents of destruction are caring human beings. They're people who have been so deeply manipulated by this destructive system that they've even lost touch with themselves. I mean, even somebody like a Trump, you can, if you think back, there was a time when that little Donald Trump was a little infant, just cooing, wanting love. He didn't get love. He got slapped, and he got to like harden up. And as he grew to be a child, he got to think that the only way I could be successful is like totally kill those parts of myself that want softness, and just don't even allow that. So when you look at people like that, for all the amount of hate and destruction they put out there to others in the world, we can recognize that they do the same to themselves. Now, that doesn't mean we should allow them to take over our world and do the harmful things, but it means that we need to engage in struggling against the harms that they do, but without turning them into demons, without dehumanizing them, because that process of turning the other into the enemy is the very process of separation that allows these conflicts to continue again and again. So every time we look at somebody and say, I can't stand that asshole, we're actually helping the very values that get us so angry in that person to begin with, the very values that lead to the destruction of nature and the destruction of well-being in our human society. And it's difficult. Practices like meditation and connecting with nature and compassion meditation in particularly are really important. Recognizing that these are not things that reduce our power, that reduce our agency to strive for what life is calling for us right now, to make a difference, to turn things around, but actually energizes us and empowers us to actually make the right decisions, make the right actions that can truly lead towards that future of long-term flourishing.
I've tried to pack a lot into this episode, maybe too many ideas that need more space to breathe, and as such we will come back to some of these in more detail in future episodes. I encourage you to explore the work, books and ideas of our guests, George Monbiot, Sharon Blackie, Jeremy Lent and Brooke Palmieri, and find out more about Alan Watts at alanwatts.org. At the beginning, thanks to Alan, Sharon and Jeremy, we explored the origins of the mechanised and combative metaphors of the egg and sperm race, and how for nearly 2,000 years the idea of our superiority and dominance over nature has skewed our relationship with it. In fact, even thinking about nature as an it needs to be challenged. We are, after all, interdependent with nature. And let's face it, machines make for a lousy metaphor for living things. Organisms are self-organising. They grow from the inside out. Mechanical objects are constructed of separate parts. They're built, not grown. And yet this way of thinking stubbornly remains. It is ironic too that as a culture we find it easier to imagine machines gaining consciousness and agency through AI than attributing intelligence to the very universe in which they were created. Some of the new myths and narratives presented by our guests in this episode do seem to be gaining traction, not least a shift away from perceiving nature as predominantly driven by aggressive competition. Recent research into the relationship between trees, plants and mycelium networks rejects the idea of the tallest tree in the forest being the winner and presenting the forest instead as a community driven largely by mutual cooperation, sharing and symbiosis. Even the latest discoveries around the science of human reproduction now tell us that sperm actually evolved teams that swim together. Even sperm, it turns out, are cooperative. And finally, a sobering thought, for this presenter at least. Jeremy Lent states halfway through the episode that we need to change the entire state of our system. I agree with him, for the sake of our planet and ourselves. But even if all of these new myths discussed in this episode were to become embedded in our societies of the future, it's important that we remember that one day they too will seem antiquated, eventually superseded by narratives that better fit different cultural and societal needs, whatever they might be, somewhere down the line. Myths, after all, are living things, like organisms, and unlike machines. They grow and change from the inside out. All we can do is try and tell the stories that we need for our time. For what are we but our stories? Adventures in Nutopia was produced and presented by me, David Bramwell, and with music from Oddfellows Casino. For more info, go to drbramwell.com or contact me on Twitter @drbramwell. Huge thank yous to all of my guests in this episode and for the support of Hawkwood College of Future Thinking. This podcast is made possible by the generous sponsorship of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. Wait, Druids you say? Aren't they all just about wearing white robes, hanging around Stonehenge and listening to the Levellers? No. Isn't there human sacrifice? No, that was propaganda put about by Julius Caesar. But you have to have a beard and carry a staff, right? No. Are they passionate environmentalists with a love of storytelling and art, herbalism, divination, and with an added spiritual dimension and ritual practices that connect with the seasons, the elements, and nature? Yeah, that's what druids are. Do they drink mead? Actually, yeah, they do drink quite a lot of mead. Find out more about what the Order does and offers on their website at druidry.org. If you've enjoyed Adventures in Nutopia, please leave a review for us, tell your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to find out about future episodes.